Everybody, welcome back to another fun and exciting Algebra 1 class. Today we are going to be talking about slope-intercept form. Okay, and if you have your books, it's right there on page 106. 106. And this is lesson 3.4. Sometimes you'll hear me call it slope-intercept form, and sometimes you'll hear me call it y-intercept form. I'm meaning the same thing when I say it. And the reason I'm saying it that way, because the intercept that it's talking about is the y-intercept. So when it says slope dash, see that little dash right there? It's in your book. So it's called slope and then dash intercept form. Well, what is the slope? We know that the slope is the m, or the slope is the rise over the run. So in this case, which intercept is it talking about? It's talking about the y-intercept. So sometimes you'll hear me call this the y-intercept form. Okay? So if you hear me call it y-intercept, slope-intercept, it's the same thing. I'm talking about the same form, the same standard form. Now, this is not standard form. We learned standard form in the last chapter, or the last lesson. But this is called slope-intercept form. It's just a different way of writing the equation. All right, what does that mean? Let's take a look at it. We would write this, and again, it's right in your book on page 106. We would write the slope-intercept form y equals mx plus b. Y equals mx plus b. That is slope-intercept. Now, it's important that you understand what these things are, okay? And in this, y is, we'll call it y is the y point, the coordinate point that goes with y. X is the x point. Okay. And m is, you should know what m is. That's the slope. Now b, this is a new one for you. The b is the y-intercept. The y-intercept. So when you look at this formula right here, the y is just the y point. Whatever point, whatever the coordinate point is for xy. The x is the x coordinate point. This is the important thing right here, one of the important things. That is the slope. Notice how it is slope-intercept form. And then this b is this right here. B is the y-intercept. B is the y-intercept. So what does the b look like? All right, so here's what the b should look like. The b is going to equal coordinate point 0, comma, y, whatever the y point is. Okay. Now, not necessarily this y point, but the y point that coordinates with the slope in the slope-intercept form, or the y-intercept. So you'll see what I mean in just a second. It'll kind of start to make sense here in just a little bit, because this is kind of neat. We can actually graph from this form. So if you get an equation in this format right here, the slope-intercept form, we can graph the equation. We don't have to find all the points. We don't have to test. You remember how we had to do the chart and testing all that stuff? We don't have to do that anymore. This is a shortcut. Working in the y-intercept form is it's a little bit easier to me. It'll be harder to you at first, but I think as you start doing it, you'll understand it little by little. All right, so on page 106, it says using the slope-intercept to graph a line. The first thing we need to do is identify the y-intercept, and that's right here. We want to identify this b, the slope or the y-intercept. Then the second thing we want to do is we want to identify the m, or the slope. So we have to identify the y-intercept and the slope. And that makes sense because this is called slope-intercept form. Slope y-intercept form. The second thing that we would do is we would plot the y-intercept on the graph. Interesting. And then we would plot a second point using the slope. And you'll see what this looks like in just a second. And then the third thing there on page 106 is we would graph the line. We would draw our line passing through those 2 points. Because you need 2 points, right? So in this, you're going to have a point. That's going to be the y-intercept point. And your second point is going to come from the slope. How do we get the point from the slope? Well, we just count. You'll see what I'm talking about when we start doing one of these. All right. You can look at that example. I'll go ahead and do the example right here on the page for you. It's y equals 3x minus 2. So if you go back to page 106 and you're looking and it says the first thing that you need to do is identify the y-intercept. Well, that's quite easy in this actually because it's right there. The y-intercept, that is the b. The b term is the y-intercept. So what is the y-intercept in this one? Remember how I said to write it like this, b equals, so we'd have b, let me come up with a different color here, b equals, and then the 0 is always the x on the y-intercept because you don't come off the y, or excuse me, you don't come off the x line, okay? So the x line, you don't go either way on the x line, you stay right there in the middle, it's just up or down, okay? And so the 0 is always the x, and what is the y? It's the minus 2. Okay, and so that's our first point that we would graph. So if I come down here and I'm just going to put like a makeshift graph on here, it's not going to be perfect. But I would go here and I would graph this line, or this point, 0, negative 2. 0, negative 2. So I'm not going to go off of this line right here. I'm just going up and down. Why? Because my x is 0. I don't go either way. I don't run at all. I'm just going down 2. So let's call this 1, 2, and we would put our point right there. That is our y-intercept where it crosses the y line, negative 2. Okay, 0, negative 2, negative 2 right there. That's our y-intercept. All right, so the next thing that we're supposed to do is we are supposed to identify the slope. Identify the slope. Now, this is a place where students tend to mess up, so be careful. I want you to pay attention to this. That slope is 3. Okay? Now, what does that mean? That means that the slope, we'll write it down here. I'll write it in white. The m equals 3. But I told you that I always like it when you write it y over x. So how do you write 3 as a fraction? 3 over 1. And that is so important because so many times students mess up right there because they don't count over 1 when they're doing their slope. So now what we want to do is we want to go back to our graph and we want to graph this slope, 3 over 1 slope. So let's go back to our graph and we're gonna count 3 over 1. Let me draw a few lines on this so we can kind of see where we're going. All right, so we are going to go over 1. Why? Because it's 3 over 1. That's our slope. And so this is y over x. And so our x is 1, and we're going 1 to the right because it's positive. So we go 1 over, and then we're going to go 3 on the y. So we're going to go 3 up. 1, 2, 3. And so our second point would be right there. 1 over, 3 up. Now, what it says in the point slope intercept form of a graph, how to graph the line, point 3 or step 3, is to graph the line. But Mr. Steve, I don't understand. You have 2 points, right? Look, you have a point right here, and you have a point right here. Those are 2 points. So whenever you have 2 points, you can go ahead and you can draw your line. I'll try to get a semi-straight line. That's not real good. That's not real good either. It's hard to draw a line on this. There we go. All right, so there's my line. It passes through both of those points, and that would be what's called the equation, the graph of the equation y equals 3x minus 2. And you can label that if you want to. You could say y equals 3x minus 2. And that's that line right there. Okay? That line that we drew, that's that equation right there. How did we get it? Well, let's go back and talk about that again real quick, okay? Because this is kind of the lesson right here. If you don't get this, then you don't understand the lesson. We got that by, first of all, finding the y-intercept, the b, okay? What is the b in this one? It's this right here. It's -2. And so the way that you write that is 0, -2, because it's a y-intercept. So it's 0 on the x. It's always 0 on the x. So we'd come over here, 0 on the x, 1, 2, and that's our first point. Then we find the slope, and the slope is 3 over 1. So we're going to rise 3, run 1, rise 3, run 1, and there we are on our second point. And then once you get your 2 points, you just draw your line. If you will, go ahead and look down at page 108. And on page 108, it has a little example there where what do you do if it says m equals 3 and the y-intercept equals 0, 1? What if they tell you, I want you to put that into slope-intercept form? I want you to build an equation. Well, let's do that. That's not that hard, actually. Let's just write out what is the slope-intercept form. That's y equals mx plus b. And now what we're going to do is we're going to substitute in where you see the m, we're going to put a 3. And where you see the y-intercept, or you could call this the b, equals 1. You say the b equals 1, I don't understand. Because the x is always 0. It has to be 0. So the only thing that you need to write for the y-intercept is that it intercepts the y at 1. And so we would put 1 in for the b. So what would that look like? That would look like y equals 3m, excuse me, I wrote that wrong, 3x, because we're substituting the 3 in for the m, 3x plus b, the b equals 1. And so there you go. Y equals 3x plus 1. That would be your converting it into y-intercept form. If you look over on page 109, the last thing I need to show you for this lesson is right here. What happens if it doesn't have a slope? What if you have a 0 slope, or in other words, you have a horizontal line or potentially a vertical line? You could have either one, okay? And so what happens in this case? So the slope in this case is 0. Instead of writing slope, we could just write m, okay? So that's m. We'll just write m. And then the y-intercept in this one is going to be 0, 5. So, in fact, let me leave that slope on there. All right. So what is the m? The m equals 0, because that's the slope. What is the b? The b is going to equal 5, positive 5. Okay, and then so we're just going to plug into y equals mx plus b. So we'd have a 0 go here, and we'd have a 5 go there. So what does that look like? Y equals m, which was 0, times x plus b. Let me put a line through that so you can see it's a 0. If not, it looks like ox, and that's strange, okay? But, so 0x, and you don't see 0x, so it looks weird when you see it. In algebra, we always want to do what we can do, solve what we can solve, and there is something that can be, I can't believe I just did that. I'm losing my mind. I wrote B. I should have wrote 5. I'm sorry about that. There we go. So ox plus 5. Well, 0x plus 5. Okay? And so in algebra, we always want to do what we can do. And so look, I can do that. 0 times anything is always 0. So 0 plus 5 equals 5. So you get y equals 5. Now that looks strange. That looks weird, right? Because that's not in slope-intercept form, but it is. Okay? In other words, you can't write it in, I guess you could leave it like this. Technically you could, but I don't want it like that. I want you to go ahead and solve it out to the simplest form. If you ever get one with a 0 slope or an undefined slope or something like that, you're going to actually solve out as much as you can solve out. Okay? I think that's all I have for you. If you have any questions on there, you can just go back through the lesson, rewind it, watch it again, try to figure that out, and practice some of these. There's lots of practice problems there on page 109, and lots of things that you can do, and try to practice and get it on a graph paper and try to move it over, move it up, go back to the graph over here that I showed you, and you know, try to figure out how do I move it, where do I put it, and try to figure all that out on those example problems there. If you have any questions, you can always just put it right there in the comments and ask me any question that you might have, okay? All right, we'll see you later. You have a good one. Bye-bye.